So in this chapter, I wanted to discuss a bit about situations where you're given an asset and for whatever reason you're not provided with enough texture reference, photography that you can actually use for your painting. So given the same prop that I've been painting, I'm going to assume that these four images are the only ones that I've been given from production. And they don't have any other images, there's nothing else, but they want the asset that I have to look like this. So you're kind of put in a position where you have to be a bit creative with how you build your textures in order to achieve this kind of realism. It has a lot of stuff going on. I mean, ideally in a perfect world, you would get scans like these that are incredibly large with amazing detail, and you can just kind of paint away. But more often than not, you're not going to get scans like these, and you won't be able to. You won't be given the props from production to scan. So you got to be a bit creative. And so I wanted to go through and show you a bit, a couple methodologies that I use in order to rebuild textures from scratch. So what I start with is these reference images. And what I've done is I've actually gone in and projected them very, very quickly in body paint with the same method, and just to get coverage. So obviously nothing's balanced, there's a lot of stretching, nothing's blended, but that's okay because for my purposes all I want to see is kind of markers and reference points to where I want to put the detail. So I know I should put a crack here in the texture map, and I know where the gold trim should be in the texture map. These things will be good guidelines when you start rebuilding your textures. So the first thing I want to do is flatten all these down and call this my reference layer. And now I want to go through and systematically start rebuilding the textures, which I'm going to start with the leather. Now this leather's very complex, and actually from my projections you can see there's a lot going on in not just the level of detail but the size of the cracking depending on where it's positioned and where it's been made on the model. So there's a lot of finer cracks and folds in this part of the clock. However, on the top of the clock there's much larger ones. So these are kind of details that you definitely want to keep in mind when you paint your textures, because if I were to go in here and throw on a texture, a leather texture that has the same crack detail all throughout, that's going to start looking very, very CG because everything's uniform and perfect. So to begin, I've gathered a couple leather images from online. I actually picked them up at cgtextures.com. It's one of my favorite sites to use as a resource for textures. And I just started picking textures that I thought I'd like to use. And the way I've decided on picking these is I started with the reference image, and I went through and in my mind started to think about how I wanted to deconstruct these textures and how I wanted to basically reconstruct them using found photographs. So for instance, for the back of this, I already know that this leather texture here is a really nice base leather texture that I want to find somewhere online, because this is going to be my first step in covering this entire clock. Because when this clock was first made, it would be made with this leather brand new and everything would be nice and clean, so you wouldn't get all these chips and scratches and peeled away pieces. So I want to find a base leather, or at least recreate a base leather that's very similar to this, so I can cover most of the model and be pretty safe. So I found a leather texture online that's something very close to what I want. There's a lot of detail in here, and it has the same kind of crackling detail in terms of scale that I'm looking for. So I'm going to start by just hitting V and dragging and dropping this in to my PSD. I can close this guy. And then I'm going to hit Control T for transform and shrink it down. I'm going to zoom in and start looking at the ratio of this leather pattern to the front piece, and it's pretty close. I'm pretty happy with the scale of this. So I'm going to start trying to get the values a bit closer by leveling things out. This image itself is very high contrasted, so I'm going to try to take some of that contrast out and give it much more of a flatter, supple look. And Control U for the saturation and hue. And I'm going to start bringing this up, taking this down. Control B for the color balance. I'm going to start noodling this. Control L for levels. So there. Pretty happy with this. So this right now is a really nice base leather that I'm going to put in here as a starting point for the front. I'm going to hit M, Control Alt with the 2 double arrows and just drag it over to duplicate the layer. And right now I'm not going to worry about patterning and repeating patterns, because I'm going to be doing a lot of overlays and a lot of layers on top that's going to start hiding a lot of this pattern stuff. So for right now, I just want to kind of cover this front piece. I want to make sure there's no crazy seams. And I'm okay with this right now. Clean that up a bit later. Merge that down. So right now, this is a nice flat leather texture. I'm going to decide to actually bring this over and cover the entire front side. Just dragging it on over to get full coverage. Merge all that down. Call this base leather. So, I have a fairly decent base leather. I'm not going to worry about the fact that this is a bit more red, maroon, and this is a bit more yellow. I'm actually going to make an executive decision, because I know this level is nice and flat even, that I'm going to kind of get in between the two. Because right now I feel like this is still a bit too red, and I want to get it more of a neutral yellow tone. And it is a bit dark, so I want to bring this up. Bring a little red back. So here's a nice even color. Now, this alone is a really nice base, and I can actually just take this entire thing and say I just want to cover the entire piece of leather. Just drag it on over. So now I have really nice even leather all the way around. I'm not going to worry about the direction of this leather currently. It seems to be a bit more vertical than the reference. For me, I want to get a similar feel. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but my goal is to try to find textures that will provide similar amounts of detail and levels of detail. And I'm happy with what this is achieving right now. So I'm going to leave it. So right now, I can already tell you that obviously this base leather texture, name that properly, is too even and clean. So if I were to drop this into body paint. These are the projections that I ended up doing. I'll have to resave this. Body paint's acting up a bit. So here's the base leather, and for the most part it's pretty nice. There's a lot of detail in there, and it's a really good base starting point for my textures. So I'm happy with this. Now comes the task of adding more levels of complexity and detail. So what I'm going to start with is I want to start breaking up this base color. I just want to give a nice broad overall breakup just to get rid of this really even brown red leather tone. So I'm going to go back to some of the images that I grabbed, and I found a couple of these images that I really liked. It had some nice broad detail. And I'm just going to copy, select that, oops, just drag and drop it in, and I'm just gonna arbitrarily place it around. Not worrying about too much in this because it's going to be a very subtle effect. I just want to get some coverage. There. So I'm going to take all these, flatten these down. I'm going to desaturate it, Shift Control U, and do an overlay. And just check it. Now it's a bit bright, so I want to take this whole thing down. There. So it blends a bit better. So already there's some really nice different type of frequency detail that was very quick to create. Just a simple overlay. I'm going to call this grunge. And it provides me some kind of dirt on top, which is going to be a nice subtle effect in my textures. Reload this. So already it's very subtle, but it really helps break up some of these surfaces just slightly. Gives you some nice extra detail down here. It gives you a little bit more of a sense that it's a bit more weathered and it's not exactly brand new. However, it is still very, very clean. So next task is to start adding some more details. And the nice thing about rebuilding your textures is that you have complete control over every layer that you create. So if for instance, if I were to hide all these, now all of this detail, the base leather, the dirt, the cracks, they're all in one layer. So as I was showing you and demonstrating how I would paint the color maps with photographic reference, it became very apparent that there's a lot of custom things that I had to do on top of this color map in order to get more control over this color map. And sometimes it is more difficult to do it that way. So opting out to just rebuilding your textures is one really great way to make sure you maintain complete control. So I have control over how much dirt is on top, and I have control over the quality of the leather underneath. So essentially you're reconstructing the history of this texture, which is really fun for me, and I really enjoy kind of deconstructing it from the image in my head and start rebuilding it to that level of weathering. So now I have this really nice grunge layer. I have a base leather layer, and these are really good starting points for me and for this leather. So now let's start adding a bit more details. Now I want to go in and start adding some of this lighter kind of scratches and peeled off areas to the map. So I'm going to go back to my reference, and I found some really cool, this really cool suitcase. It had some really interesting chipping details. And I'm just going to grab this guy here, unlock it, copy it, paste it in, and I'm just going to start experimenting with this, seeing what kind of look I can get. So I know I want these lighter areas, but I don't want all this brown because I already have a nice base texture here. So what I'm going to do is do a screen and then go to my levels adjustment and just bring it down until those areas start fading away, like that. And this is a bit too saturated, so I'm going to go to my saturation and take that down about there. And I'm going to check the reference. So I'm going to go to a layer mask, just paint away this edge here because it doesn't go all the way down in. I check the reference again. Now the reference obviously has specific chips and stuff, and this is good stuff to keep in mind when you paint yours. But for this demonstration, I just want to show you quickly how to get these details rather quickly. If it were me in production, I'd probably spend a lot more time refining these chipped areas. But for right now, I'm just going to quickly throw some in just to give you an idea of how to get this layer. And I really like this piece here because I'm going to mimic it for one of my edges down here. Hide all that. Go down. Just find that edge. Just kind of arbitrarily drag it up there. Same thing. Screen. Bring the levels down. About there. Saturation, bring that down. And then I'm just going to quickly erase out this kind of sharp edge here that I know I don't want. Just kind of clean some of this up. There. So already, if I were to save this out, and reload it, I have this really cool chipped edge on my clock that really helps, really gets very close to what I had originally from the reference. And I have some chipping up here, which has some really nice fine detail. And it was very, very quick and easy to do. And so now, the best thing about this is that I can take these two layers, group them, call it chip layer, And now I have complete control over this layer, and I can have this forever. So when I start creating most importantly, creating my spec and displacement and bump maps, this is already isolated out. So I can basically do whatever I want with these textures. Whereas if I had this original piece here, what I had to do in the previous demonstration was go in and quickly hand carve all of these pieces out, which is very tedious and sometimes time consuming. So very quickly I got some very interesting detail on this edge with very little amount of work. And this goes back to, making sure photographic reference works for you, and finding that right image to really manipulate and throw into your model. And you can see there's some really nice leather detail, and on top of that leather detail we're getting some of this chipping, which is very similar to a reference. If we can go back. Looking at some of this. So we get some of this nice chip detail, a lot of this leather, and it's a really nice effect that we can continue throughout the model and just further tweak. So in production, what I would do is I know that this leather texture really is successful for me. So either I would search for more types of suitcases or luggage or any kind of leather that would have weathering like this online, or I'd simply go out and have my camera and start shooting reference. Because all I really need, because for this kind of detailing I don't need to worry about lighting, because for this reference I would never use this as a base texture because there's too much reflection in there, there's too much lighting in there. It just would be a pain to paint all that out and it wouldn't really work for me. But I know that this kind of detailing through the screen adjustment mode, I can get this really nice high frequency stuff. So when you start rebuilding your textures from scratch, you start creating this kind of mental note of types of textures that will work, and when you implement them into your base maps. So I'm really happy with these cracks. And given if I were to finish this entire thing, I would go through and find more cracks like this. In fact, I'd go to this one. Go to this one here. And just copy this on over. Put in my chipped layer. Bring this on down. I'm going to flip this. The way I flip this is when I'm in transform, when I hit Control T, if I right click, I can go down and flip vertically or flip horizontally or any kind of these, which is really handy. Is a really handy tool rather than having to go all the way up here, edit, transform, flip, rotate. It's much quicker. So I'm going to just quickly scale this up, not being too picky. I want to see where this edge is. A bit over. There we go. Go to screen. Bring down the levels. And saturation. What I'm going to do real quick is take this, duplicate it, bring it on over here. Lower it a bit, just so I have some kind of organic edge on this side. And voila. Save this out. And reload this. Alrighty, very quickly we get some really interesting details on this edge. Now, seeing this on the model now, it's a bit overbearing, so I'd probably go in and refine some of this edge here by simply creating a layer mask and start painting out some of this detail. Oh, wrong layer. layer mask, painting out some of this. Let's get a harder edge brush. Just to get a bit of a thinner edge. And again, by using a layer mask that I'm using, it's non-destructive. So say I painted this stuff out and I go back and I'm like, you know what, it doesn't look so good. I can just hide the layer mask. If I hit Shift and click on the layer mask, it unhides. So it eliminates what you've been painting. So it goes back to the original layer. So I can see very quickly what I've done and what I've taken out. I can go back and further refine that. And this is going back to that non-destructive workflow that you want to try to maintain, because it's going to make your life incredibly easier later down the line when you have to do a lot of adjustments very quickly. So let's reload that and see how that looks. So there, I'm much happier with that. It gives a really nice organic edge to this. So already this is shaping up very nicely for me in terms of getting some of that original weathering in there and recreating this kind of old leather clock. So I have all these nice layers all organized and named so I can remember what I've been doing. And now I want to go in and add some of these really cool cracks that are in here. So I found this really cool image online. I'm not quite sure what this is. I think this is kind of another type of leather that has some buckling detail that I really like. And I'm going to go through and just try to find some pieces that I like that are working for me. Copy it, paste, and I'm going to unhide that and just bring this down. Resize it. Just kind of place it in the same, approximately the same area the original cracks are. This is a nice detail. And I'm going to invert this just to see, just get that inside, that edge darker. And I'm going to try to color correct this a bit. Okay, and then create a layer mask for this because I don't want some of this detailing. I'm gonna hide some of this out. Let's turn this to pen pressure. Start fading some of this back and blending this a bit better. This is a bit saturated. There we go. So there's a nice crack that was very, very quick and easy, but provides some really nice detail. There. Now I probably go in and refine this a bit more just to get this blending a bit better, but right now I'm really happy with the way this is looking, this crack. And I know, just testing that out as a quick experiment, that that's successful for me. So I'm going to come in here and I have the pick of the litter for all these different cracks that I want, that I can arbitrarily put in and start adding logical weathering and buckling in this. And again, the best thing about this is a separate layer. So I have control over what I want to do with this. Let me integrate this a bit better. There. So these are just a couple techniques that I love to use in order to start rebuilding my own textures. Now what I'd probably do is I really like this base leather. However, like I mentioned earlier, if we were to hide all this, there's this really nice larger scale leather that's going on. So I'd probably go in and try to resolve this issue where this leather kind of blends up to here. Again, it really depends on if we're honestly ever going to see the top of this. Maybe we won't. So it might just be good to leave it as is and just continue to add more weathering, maybe more staining and just discoloration. But for right now, I'm going to leave it because the techniques we'll be using to that I'd be using to recreate this are very similar. Just to be very quick about it, I'll show you really quickly what I might do. So I have this leather here, which has a very similar texture to what I was looking for up top. I'm just going to take this and drag this in. And I'm going to quickly check this to the base. And it's a bit larger, so let's scale that down to about here. This is good. Let's bring this in, and so we have a nice layer here. Let's desaturate it. Control Shift U. Let's bring this back, and then let's try with a screen. Let's see, if this is what we want. Yeah, this is going to be nice. So if we zoom in, there's nice detail on top that kind of mimics this. However, we're getting some confliction with this base leather because there's detail in here. So what I'm going to do really quick is duplicate this base layer and just blur it to about there, about 4 pixels. And if I reveal this again, I have this really nice texture here. However, it's a bit bright and a bit neutral, so I'm going to color correct this a bit. Get some yellow red and just take the opacity down to about 50%. Turn on my layer here, my grunge layer, and my chips. And already very quickly I have this really nice top layer. Now obviously I just want it for the top piece of this, so I'm going to create a layer mask and just start painting away areas that I don't want for this crack and groove layer. It's about here. And I'm going to create a layer mask for this blurred leather, completely invert it so it's disappeared, and then paint back, reveal some of that base just for this top piece. So we lose some of that really high frequency leather that we didn't really like. And already we have a really nice higher, larger scale wrinkles. Now I'm going to probably duplicate that, merge it down, and then take it down a bit just to get more out of it. And then let's save that. Reload. So up top we get this really nice larger scale leather. I would probably go in more and refine the blend here, but this gives you a really quick example of how I can get a larger scale leather up top so everything's not completely uniform. In terms of the rest of these edges, I would go in and actually project some of this really nice detailing that I have here along some of these back edges, just to give some more organic feel to how it's been weathered back there. But so far I'm really liking some of this detailing in the front, and we're getting some of this nice photorealistic look that we're going for. And for the final step for this color map, just to show you a bit more, I don't want to go through and do everything because I think you kind of get the idea of how I've rebuilt some of these textures and the power of having everything in layers. Because it's going to make my job so much easier when I create my bump, displacement, and spec maps, because everything is separated. And so I have complete control over what I want to do in my other maps. So the last thing I want to do is quickly add some of this gold trim. And I'm going to hide all this. Go back to my reference layer and just grab this gold trim here. Again, it's just reference for placement. Bring that all the way to the top. Let's see this. And let's just take a look at this. So it's basically just gold paint on top of the leather. So it's not a different texture. It doesn't have a thick kind of paint. So it's just kind of really thinly painted on top, which is good for us because that means we can just quickly take this, create a matte, draw a matte from this. This is a really quick, easy way just to get some of this back. And create a new layer. And just grab an arbitrary gold here. Drop that in. Let's bring that up. Let's check it. Definitely more yellow. Let's see if we do an overlay. Not quite what we want. Just copy it, bring it down, and see how that looks. It's a bit closer. And this is all about just experimenting and just figuring out some really nice, quick, easy ways to put some details in. Obviously, this isn't matching up. This isn't going all the way down, and that's stuff that I would resolve. But again, I just want to show you a quick method of rebuilding your own textures from scratch. So there. It's a nice gold trim that we have complete control over. Again, I'd go down and resolve these issues here. Just make sure the trim goes all the way down. Although, you know, I kind of like this. I kind of like that the trim doesn't go all the way down. I kind of like that it fades. So maybe I'll just start bringing some of it back up from below and leave some of this fading. I think some of this is nice and organic. And some of those kind of serendipitous acts when you're going through your painting process are really going to pay their dividends in the end when you send it through Look Dev. And it's these happy accidents that really honestly help give your textures more organic feel, more of an organic feel, and help sell the illusion of realism. So yeah, here's a quick, easy way to rebuild some of your textures. Again, this is just the first step to rebuilding some of my maps. And what I do is, let's just group this and call this rebuild. And then you can see that we're starting very quickly to gain some of those details back. And a nice thing about this reference layer is that I can go back to this and quickly see, okay, you know, these chipped layers here are actually pretty saturated compared to mine. So, hey, I have this in a separate layer, so I can quickly go back and start adding some of that and really kind of defining it a bit better. So very, very, very quickly I can start getting much closer to that reference. And it's all about going back to your reference and really observing the details and deconstructing them in your mind. And let's actually quickly do that to all of these, because I kind of like that detail. Let's bring that back in. And throw that back on the model. So already, there we go. It's getting much, much closer to blending a bit better. And that's key because, you know, if you were to just rebuild this from your mind and saying, you know what, this is the way it's going to look in my head, if you don't constantly go back to your reference, you're going to miss a lot of things, a lot of subtleties. And we have some of these white areas that I'll paint out eventually. But yeah, this is a quick and easy way to rebuild your texture. And I think it's very important to show you this because, you know, majority of the times you're going to be in situations where you don't have enough reference. And you're going to find that it's actually a blessing in disguise, because when you rebuild your textures, you have everything separated out. And so you have complete control over what you're doing, and you're not a slave to the reference. That there are a lot of limitations in painting directly from a photograph. Although it's nice to get those details, it takes a lot of time to extract what you need in your bump and displacement and spec maps. Whereas if you rebuild it from scratch with just a couple very, very simple leather textures, you start getting some really nice realism. So yeah, just wanted to show you that.